Although this video is an overview of the amphibians which one can find in the northeastern United States, I would like to just begin with a few points to provide an emphasis for why local wildlife are important. So first is the idea that all groups of organisms, and amphibians are particularly vulnerable, can have members which are in danger of extinction. So there are amphibians which have gone extinct, and there are amphibians which are approaching extinction and are on the endangered list for protection. One of the reasons for this is that while some species are very widespread, they are common, they inhabit a broad geographic range. As you can see here, many species have a much narrower range. And so therefore, if there is habitat loss in a small region of the world, this could threaten the only surviving populations, and thus biodiversity. Value this species of not measure its population, and that can be lost. And people living in another part of the country and world, the same then would apply. Amphibians today face many threats because they depend on water, because they breathe through their skin. They are sensitive to drought, to climate change. They are affected by chemicals. There is a chytrid fungus, which we think has been spread at least in part due to the pet trade. Bringing in species of amphibian and transporting them has then allowed a fungus to spread that otherwise would not have. And so amphibians in general, do face more threats and are endangered at a higher percentage than most groups of animals. And if one were to consider different parts of the world, such as, for example, Paraguay, where I lived while I was in the Peace Corps, one notices that each part of the world has its own distinct types of amphibians. So first of all, in southern continents, there can be a group of amphibians known as caecilians, which don't occur in the northern continents. If one were to look at frogs, one would see that there are frogs of the family Bufonidae in both the Northeast United States and in Paraguay. But many of the species in Paraguay do not exist here, and there is a greater number of toads which can be found in Paraguay. Although, as a country, it is, perhaps comparable to the size of, say, New York State and Pennsylvania. If you look at this family of frogs, it is found in Paraguay and other regions of Latin America, but not in North America. And just running through the different types of frogs, there are tree frogs which live in the northeast of the United States, and there are tree frogs which live in Paraguay. This family of frogs is adapted to climb trees, although not all of them do. And you can see that they have expanded tips of their digits, which help them accomplish that. But if you were to look at, just the diversity of tree frogs, which one can find in Paraguay, this greatly exceeds the several species which occur in the Northeast United States. So here are additional species, some large, some small, some quite colorful, as you can see there. And then just running through, there are other families. This family is not found in the Northeast United States. This family is not found in the Northeast United States, nor are these. Okay. Then nor is this family found in the Northeast United States. And so if you were to compare um, uh, amphibians from one part of the world to another. Notice that Paraguay doesn't have salamanders. There, can be occasional salamanders, just a few in northern South America. But so Paraguay has a group of amphibians which North America lacks: the Sicilians and lacks the salamanders found in the Northeast United States in some abundance. When it comes to the frogs, one can see how diverse the frogs are, so that each part of the world has its own distinctive set of families which live there. And even if families are shared in different parts of the world, there can be different species and different numbers of species. So with this in mind, I'd like to offer an overview of the frogs which live in Orange County in the northeast of the United States. So frogs are amphibians, which means that they are tetrapods, partially adapted to life on land with arms and legs. They breathe air through lungs, but that they lack many of the adaptations for life on land that one would find in what are known as the amnios, the reptiles, birds, and mammals. Amphibians are still at least partly dependent on water. They're most likely to be found in aquatic habitats. Their skin needs to be kept moist. They actually do a bit of breathing through their skin, so that their lungs are not very effective. So frogs, although they use their lungs, they breathe substantially through their skin. And the most common salamanders in our area, the family Plepidontidae, they actually don't have lungs at all. They do all of their breathing through the skin. And so here you can see how moist the skin is. They typically reproduce using water, although there are exceptions to this. And this is why frogs mating, very often with distinctive mating calls. This is done in the vicinity of water, and the eggs are laid in water. So here you can see frog eggs. And note that tadpoles, when they first hatch from their eggs, they have a more elongated shape than they have later. And notice that for the first couple of days, they can possess gills, once again showing that they are living a double life, if you will, partially adapted to both water and land. In tadpoles, these external gills are reabsorbed, and then they rely on internal gills, while in salamanders, the external gills will persist. And so here you can see that after a couple of days, the gills are reabsorbed, and then they possess only internal gills. Amphibians are often more active at night than they are in the day. And so, certainly at certain times of the year, frogs can be heard calling at night. But if one were to truly appreciate, amphibian diversity, then studying some at night would be important. Amphibians are often underestimated when it comes to their diversity. There are studies where if one were to take, say, all of the salamanders in an area and weigh them, that they would actually exceed, say, on an acre of land, the weight of the mammals and the birds which are found there. Now, very often these amphibians are coming out at night, and many of the salamanders are burrowing. So there's actually a family of salamanders known as the burrowing salamanders, the ambistomids. And so therefore, very often our Northeast United States is very rich in amphibian diversity, although we may not appreciate that it is there. Now, frogs undergo a very startling metamorphosis in their life cycle compared to, say, salamanders. So frogs have this tadpole, which looks relatively unlike the adult frogs. These tadpoles are herbivores. Primarily, they are filter feeders ingesting primarily algae. And that's interesting because the adults are never herbivores. All adult frogs are carnivorous, but they're depending on the algae during photosynthesis as larvae. As a result, they need more intestine to process this this phytoplankton so that they have a prominent tail as larvae, but the tail is reabsorbed as they then transform into adults, developing their arms and their legs. While it is possible in some frogs, not in our area, for all of this development to occur, say in the egg or on the back of a parent, all frogs in this area need to develop in water, although that there are some frogs, such as toads, which spend only a very short time in the tadpole stage. So some frogs undergo direct development as a species, and I believe that in some toads, that's even possible, even though the typical toad life cycle is to lay their eggs in water. The idea of the tadpole stage being something that can be experienced, just in under, say, a moist log, that is possible. Now, frogs, as I said, are very common, as are amphibians. And so one of the roles that amphibians play in our area is being important in food chains. And so if one were to consider the aquatic food chains, there are many fish which feed on tadpoles, which feed on adult frogs. Certainly bass are large enough that they can feed on large frogs. But then also there are a lot of birds such as herons, which go along the shore, and smaller water birds as well, which are wading. There are a number of mammals such as mink and otter and raccoons, which then prey on amphibians such as frogs as well. Now, when we look at frogs, there's a great diversity throughout the world. We actually classify the frogs into different suborders, and the two more primitive suborders of frogs do not occur in our area. And so frogs actually date back to the Mesozoic era and the age of dinosaurs. Before there were actual frogs, there were animals which had some of the features of frogs, but not others. So frogs go back to the frog ancestors to the Triassic period, and the first frogs to the Jurassic period. And because the continents had been fused to this one supercontinent, they were able to spread throughout the world at that point. The most primitive frogs alive today, which belong to the most basal order. Some of these are found in North America, but not in the northeast of the United States. So there was a branching of the frog family tree, which occurred gradually over time. And the suborder Neobatrachia is the most common, with more than 4,000 modern species. They first started here, but the majority evolved after the dinosaurs had become extinct. So in the extinction which wiped out the dinosaurs, the world changed, and the frog families which we have today, some of which originated in the aftermath of that, including some which we find in our area. So there are these different groups of frogs, which had evolved at different times, and when we look around the world, we see that all of the families, they have different distributions, some being more widespread than others. So note here that there is this family of frogs known in northwestern North America, which is one of the most primitive groups of frogs. And as discussed in other areas, that once there are such a limited distribution, that this then potentially puts some in danger of being extinction. And I'm going to, focus on the frogs in the Northeast United States. But then as one looks throughout the world, there are then frogs which are in danger of extinction for a number of reasons. Very often habitat loss, because if they depend on aquatic habitats, these habitats are often popular for human development, for the draining of swamps so that water can be directed towards irrigation. And then the pollution of water sources threatens them greatly, as does climate change, which not only alters temperature, but also changes the distribution of rainfall, etc. And so frogs in all areas, including our own, they are exposed to a number of threats. And so I go through some of the different groups of frogs in the three different suborders, including members of certain families which are in danger of extinction. The frogs in our area are known in the family Hylidae. This is the family of tree frogs, and this does include species in danger of extinction, but notice the tree frogs in general are widely distributed throughout the world. The family Ranidae, which includes the bullfrogs, and note that there are endangered species here as well. And then toads in the family Bufonidae. And once again, there are both endangered species and extinct species here. And so there are different families of frogs represented in our area. The family Ranidae includes the largest frogs in our area, the bullfrog and the green frog. And so I go through that here. So the family Ranidae has more than 600 species, a wide distribution throughout the world, but certainly in the Northeast United States, they can be found. And in our area, this includes the largest frog, the bullfrog, then the second largest frog, the green frog. And bullfrogs and green frogs can often be confused. The one best way to distinguish between them is notice this ridge, which is occurring after the tympanic membrane in green frogs, which we don't see in bullfrogs. There are other members of the family Ranidae as well, such as pickerel frogs and leopard frogs and wood frogs. And so Ranidae is well represented in our area. As the largest frogs, they are more likely to spend more than a year in the tadpole stage, as opposed to other species of frogs where the tadpole stage can be very brief. They can live multiple years, which means that during the winter they need then to hibernate and find a place where they can stay protected. And that bullfrog that you just saw was migrating from the area where it was hibernating back to a body of water in spring. And so very often it's in the first, after the first spring rain, that you see a mass migration of frogs back to bodies of water that they had to leave prior to their freezing in winter. Now, if you were to listen to their calls, as frogs mate, one of the things that females use to approach males are the calls that males make as they distend their throat and force air to make species-specific songs. So here's a green frog. Notice that ridge that I had mentioned earlier. And green frogs make different sounds. And so in spring, this is when the majority of frogs in our area are mating, although mating can occur in other seasons as well. For example, bullfrogs may mate throughout the summer. But after early spring rains, a lot of frogs, they seek out they seek out vernal pools. These are bodies of water made by melting snow, so that they can lay their eggs in an area that's then protected from um, fish predators. But obviously, these vernal pools will then melt at a certain point, and or I'm sorry, the water will evaporate. Um, and so therefore they have to lay the eggs in early spring. Here you can see a pickerel frog, which has squarish blotches along its back, and there are similar looking frogs known as leopard frogs, where the spots are a little more round and irregular. And so pickerel frogs and leopard frogs can occur in our area. Leopard frogs, there are a number of species, most of which do not occur in our area, and sometimes it can be hard to distinguish between the different species. The wood frog lives in our area and actually can survive freezing. So it is actually possible to take a frog, to put it in the freezer to freeze it, and then to revive it afterwards. And as a result, this is a frog species which can actually be found north of the Arctic Circle. So notice, it's camouflage. It blends in rather well with the, the leaves in the leaf litter. So this wood frog is in our area. And if you were to listen to their calls, they tend to mate earlier in, so you hear peepers in the background, but the lower pitch sound, which some people have compared to, say, rubbing your, say, finger on a wet balloon, the sound that it might make there. There are wood frogs calling. And the peepers and the wood frogs, they're mating and making their calls rather early in spring compared to other species such as bullfrogs, which are now mating more in summer. So just repeating that idea of a vernal pool, if eggs are laid in a lake or a stream, the problem then is that fish will eat them. But here is a temporary body of water, which is formed from melting snow. There are no fish here. So the frogs know this. Very often this was the place where they developed as tadpoles. And so they return to it to mate and to lay their eggs. And the idea there then is that the eggs will develop into tadpoles and then adult frogs before the water evaporates later in summer. So here is an image from that pool of wood frog eggs, so that there was this one time very often after an early spring rain where the frogs meet in this pool. Fertilization is typically external, with males and females releasing their gametes at the same time, and fertilization occurs outside the body of the female. The eggs are laid in these masses, which then develop into tadpoles. One of the interesting things about wood frogs is that a green alga can be associated with the eggs. And so when you look at the eggs of the wood frog, you can often see that the masses look green in color. And this is actually a symbiotic relationship, a relationship where both the algae and the frog are benefiting, because the developing frog embryo is producing carbon dioxide that the algae needs. It's producing nitrogenous waste that the algae needs, but then the algae is producing oxygen. So here under the microscope, you can see there's actually a lot of living things that can occur in these frog eggs, a lot of things moving around, including these algae. And so note that these are the developing eggs of frogs, and this algae develops in symbiosis with them, and then the frogs hatch then as tadpoles, as you can see here. Also notice the absence of fish, given that this is a vernal pool. So these are the frogs in our area in the family Ranidae, the bullfrogs, the green frogs, the pickerel and leopard frogs, and the wood frogs. There's also then the family Hylidae, which once again, these are the tree frogs, which are widely distributed throughout the world. In our area, there are only four possible species, two of which are called tree frogs or gray tree frogs. And they really look so similar that they can't be distinguished visibly, although they do make different calls. Interestingly, and this happens when we study species, that you'll notice that they vary in the number of chromosomes that they have. So the common gray tree frog has 48 chromosomes, which is double the number of Cope's gray tree frog. So one of the mechanisms of forming new species is to have a chromosomal accident where double the number of chromosomes are in the progeny compared to the parents, and this has helped to give rise to tree frogs, species which are closely related. Now, there are diverse tree frogs throughout the world, but in our area, the gray tree frogs are then also joined by this cricket frog, which is a small member of the family Hylidae, and then also it has two color morphs. One's more orange, one is more green, and the spring peeper. The cricket frog is not endangered in general, but Orange County in New York is the northernmost extension of the gray tree frog, and it only occurs in one wetland in Orange County. And so as we consider species and threats that they face, not only are some species threatened throughout their range, but other species are showing that their range shrinks. So they may be reducing their populations in some areas of their range. Here you can see that gray tree frog, and they have a very distinctive call. And so once again, females during mating season can now approach the males of their species at night because they make very distinctive calls. And one species of frog sounds very different from another. So the two species of gray tree frog are in the family Hylidae, as is a small frog, the spring peeper. These are easily heard in early spring when they mate. So notice there are small frogs, often with a cross-like pattern on their backs, and here you can hear them calling. It is only the males that call, which opens them up to predation, because obviously it's easier for predators to hear the males and find them. But then the females can approach the males, safely. They mate and lay their eggs. The spring peeper song here. And so just at the end of this video, I was mentioning that sometimes there's a bit of a trill added to spring peeper songs. You heard there. Gray tree frogs are in the frog family Hylidae, as are spring peepers, and cricket frogs are more common in more southern regions. But southern New York as is the northernmost extension of their range. And as we concern ourselves with, populations, once again, not only an entire species, but also different populations of the species, are under concern. And so in Orange County, there is concern with this species, which is, protected in Orange County because it is dwindling, and this is the northernmost part of its range. The family Bufonidae is a family of toads, and this includes then the American toad, which is a common toad in our area. There are a number of toads which can be found in general in North America, but this one is the most common. And very often their tadpoles spend very little time in aquatic environments, and so often that it's possible to find very small toads which have left the tadpole stage at a very young age compared to, say, a bullfrog, which might be in this stage for a year. Now, even though they are a bit more terrestrial, they do hopping more than jumping. They have drier skin. Nevertheless, they mate in water and do so early in the spring. So here you can hear toads calling, and there are a large group of
toads will spend most of their adult life.
And here you can kind of see a mass mating of toads. By trying to coordinate this early in the year before perhaps all of their predators have returned from migration, say the birds and the like, or before young raccoons are able to hunt on their own, they mate and lay their eggs so that then the adult toads can then take advantage of insects as they mature. And so that was an introduction into the diversity of frogs in our area. And obviously then these frogs are very reliant on the wetlands in our area and all of the environmental issues which affect these wetlands. The second group of amphibians, which lives in the Northeast United States, are the salamanders. And you can see they have a more typical body plan where they have a long tail, and they do not have those large jumping legs. Here you can see there's a clear difference between these salamanders, because just as frogs form different groups which evolved at different points in geologic history, so too did the salamanders. So the large salamander here, the spotted salamander, that's in the family Ambistomidae. Here you see the eastern newt in the family Salamandridae. Here's the adult of the eastern newt spending time in water. You just saw it there where it was feeding. All salamanders are carnivorous as both larvae and adults. And here you see eastern newts walking at the bottom of running water early in spring. Once again, they can live multiple years and then hibernate in one area and then have to make their way back to the place where they would like to breed and lay their eggs. Just as frogs had different suborders, so too did the salamanders, with some originating deeper in geologic time. The most primitive salamanders alive today include some found in the United States, but then also some of the largest salamanders, which can include some which get to be more than 3 to 4 feet in length. Note that these various families can have distinct distributions, being found only in different parts of the world, and some of them are in danger of extinction. Some have reduced the size of their legs, as in sirens, which can be found in the United States, although it's the most modern of the salamander suborders, which is found in our areas, with 3 salamander families found in our area. Plethodontidae, the lungless salamanders, Salamandridae, which includes the eastern newt, and the ambistomids, which are the largest salamanders in our area. While there are some salamanders that practice external fertilization, as in frogs, the majority practice internal fertilization. So males will produce packets of sperm known as spermatophores, and then females then grab the spermatophores with their cloacal lips and then introduce them into their own body. And so that the fertilization of the ova by sperm occurs inside the body of the female. Now, while many salamanders lay their eggs in water, where they develop into aquatic larvae with prominent external gills, there are exceptions where many salamanders simply lay their eggs on land in moist areas, say under a moist log, and then the eggs can undergo direct development and hatch as juvenile salamanders that look like the adults, not like this aquatic form. And so this is one of the interesting things about amphibians. Their reproduction style varies more than in any other vertebrate group. So for example, they can practice both internal and external fertilization. They can have aquatic larvae or undergo direct development, etc. So here you see a salamander in the family Plethodontidae. It hatched as a young adult as opposed to the as opposed to those which produce larvae. There are some salamanders which will keep their gills and then even as adults be found in aquatic environments. And I have an image of a salamander not found in our area, where that is the case here. So there are some salamanders, such as this one, which has retained its external gills. Most will then only have gills as larvae, and then live on land as adults. The family Ambistomidae, which includes some endangered species, these are large salamanders in our area and often are very rarely seen because they are often nicknamed the mole salamanders. Here's an example of those external gills in an adult, although this species wasn't found in our area. The ambistomids, they include the marbled salamander with its black and white body. Interestingly, this tends to mate in fall rather than spring. And one possible advantage of that is that its larvae then might be larger and capable of eating other salamander larvae that are from eggs laid in spring. So this marbled salamander, that may be one of its adaptations. It's very rarely seen because it tends to burrow throughout the majority of the year, where it would then say feed on earthworms and burrowing insects. And then the same would be true of the spotted salamander. So these are the two ambistomid salamanders, the large wide salamanders that you're likely to see in our area, the marbled and the spotted. The spotted salamanders are typically only seen in a year around early spring, say at night after the first warm spring rain, because they'll have to then migrate from the place where they were hibernating over winter to the body of water where they lay their eggs. And then after laying eggs, they will then leave that body of water during another rainy night, typically, to go back to where now they will burrow and hunt for, insects. Not only do the spotted salamanders have a symbiosis with green algae in their eggs, this is actually interesting where the green algae can actually exist inside the cells of the salamander. So it's not just a symbiosis, it's an endosymbiosis. And this is the only example in vertebrates where this is known, where, say, an algae can live inside the cells of the vertebrate itself. And so notice here, these are the egg masses of spotted salamanders. They're taking on this greenish hue. Note that these are now being laid in a vernal pool. Once again, those temporary pools forming from melt water and the heavier rains in early spring. And some of these algae were actually in the cells of the mother salamander. That's how they were introduced into the egg mass, and they will actually continue inside the cells of the larval salamanders. Here you can see the larvae of these spotted salamanders. They are large carnivores, and you can see these external, the prominent external gills. Once again, once they leave the larval state, they then are burrowing salamanders, that nickname of the mole salamanders, where they will, feed on earthworms, crickets, and other burrowing insects. So the diversity of salamanders is often much greater than we appreciate, all right, because many are burrowing, many come out only at night. Very often we don't see the numbers and the diversity that exist in our area. A second salamander family, Salamandridae, exists in our area, but only one member, the eastern newt. The eastern newt has an interesting life cycle. Adults mate and lay their eggs in the water, and the eggs hatch to form aquatic larvae. So here you see two adults mating in water. Once again, fertilization is internal, where the females will then grab packets of sperm released by the male. And after the aquatic stage, then you see this terrestrial eft phase. This is a different species of newt not found in our area. So let me go to ours. So the red eft, this is the immature phase of the eastern newt. It's so brightly colored because the skin is toxic. And by having a bright orange skin, this can help predators learn to avoid this foul-tasting salamander, which would make them sick. So this is a young adult, which is now going to return to the water, so it's losing the bright orange color, and this then is the terrestrial F stage. Now there is some variation. While it is typical that the eggs hatch into aquatic larvae before becoming Fs, it is possible to see direct development into the Fs from eggs. And so not only is there great variation in amphibian reproduction, you can even observe variations within a species. The adults, and here's an adult eastern newt, then lose that bright coloration. They return to water, where they do most of their hunting, and then that is also where they mate and lay the eggs, which develop into the aquatic larvae. Finally, the family Plethodontidae is a group of salamanders known as the lungless salamanders. They tend to be a bit smaller, thin, and since they lack lungs, they do all of their breathing through their skin. They typically undergo direct development, not having an, um, an aquatic phase in their life cycle. And so we have a number of different species in the family Plethodontidae, which occurs in our area. I'll just quickly review these. These would include the slimy salamander with its black body and its white spots. The family does include a number of endangered species, including some on the United States endangered species list. And I give a few examples of those. Since these salamanders are less likely to need water, they don't need it to mate, for example. They can undergo direct development, say under a moist log. Then one can find these in more terrestrial habitats. Once again, they'll typically be under leaf litter, so somewhere nocturnal, and then they can burrow to a degree where they feed on insects. Once again, the numbers of salamanders are often underestimated because the sheer mass of them can actually then surpass the weight of, say, birds and mammals found in the area. Females actually are capable of guarding their eggs to a degree, laying them in a group and being there for protection. So that's an interesting behavior, which is not typically observed in amphibians. There are also other species of salamander in this family, which occur in our area, such as the red-backed salamander, which you see here. Among the variations that one can see in these salamanders, some of them are all black. It is known as what's called a lead phase. And so just as, when we consider dogs or, many other species, there is variation in appearance among members of the same species. The same applies to these red-backed salamanders. And then there are a couple of other species in this family as well, so I'll get to here. And so here's a red F, here's that red-backed salamander. Notice that they are different. And so each area has its own unique amphibians. So Paraguay, for example, going back to the beginning, it doesn't have native salamanders, just as we don't have native caecilians. And so different organisms are found only in specific regions throughout the world. And since populations can dwindle and animals can become endangered, we should be aware of our local biodiversity, so that they can be protected. For example, there is a salamander in Virginia, which is found on one mountain in the Shenandoah Mountains. It's known as the Shenandoah salamander. So if populations are lost from that mountain, then the species becomes extinct. And so here in the background was a mountain dusky salamander, the two-line salamander. There is a diversity of salamanders in our area, and all of the environmental issues which affect wetlands and environments in general, such as climate change, such as pollution, and then even the spread of new invasive species like this chytrid fungus. They can have devastating impacts on our native wildlife.